Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of The Shift, a new series from Mondoweiss. I'm your host, Adam Horowitz, the managing editor here at Mondoweiss, and I'll be joined by our U.S. correspondent and political reporter extraordinaire, Michael Arria. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Adam.
Michael writes, as part of his work at Mondoweiss, writes a weekly politics newsletter called The Shift, which follows Palestine politics in the U.S., the discourse around Palestine in the U.S., and that's what we're going to be looking to do something similar here in this series. Each month, Michael and I will meet to talk about the biggest political stories about Palestine and the way that this is getting discussed online. So today we're going to start by taking on a few big topics. The first one will be Israel's free fall in terms of support within American politics. We'll dig into some of those numbers and look at what they actually mean. And then in our discourse segment, we will be talking about the person that everyone seems to be talking to or speaking about at this moment.
Everybody's talking to him as well, apparently.
No spoilers. Jeffrey Epstein. What to make of the latest Epstein files? Where does Israel fit into this story? And what we can learn from everything that's being shared. But first, Michael, let's talk politics. And let's talk about the fact that suddenly it seems like everybody hates Israel.
Yeah, that's true. I think in some ways, this has been a developing story since I joined Mondoweiss and started covering U.S. politics way back in 2019. And I think one of the reasons, a little inside baseball, I think one of the reasons why you've been at Mondoweiss for the long haul, but one of the reasons why I think for the first time the website might have been compelled to hire someone specifically devoted to the U.S. beat is because things were changing. Less than a year before I was hired, Rashida Tlaib arrived in Congress, the first Palestinian American member to ever be in that chamber. And there seemed to be a growing understanding of the BDS movement. And I think coming out of the Black Lives Matter protests, there was also just a deeper discussion of, these kind of connections. And it seemed like Palestine was becoming a bigger and bigger issue among progressives. For years, we were saying, progressive, except for Palestine, that was the line on a lot of people. And then it seemed like this issue was permeating for the first time, spaces that would be regarded liberal, progressive, democratic, even, at least among voters. We obviously haven't seen that shift, no pun intended, when it comes to the lawmakers for the most part. But like you alluded to, there's all kinds of polls that you can cite. But just one that stands out to me is, for instance, there was a Pew poll done, I think last March, that found 69% of Democrats have an unfavorable view of Israel. That's up 16 points from 2022. So even within the last 5 years, as we've seen the genocide play out in Gaza, I think it's undeniable. There's just overwhelming evidence when you look at the polling that the Democratic base, Democratic voters have completely flipped on this issue. And it's completely understandable that those numbers have become even more extreme in the context of what we've seen out of Gaza for the last 2.5, 3 years.
Right. But one of the things that's interesting here, and as notable as those numbers are, we're not just talking about Democrats. We're seeing similar numbers in a way amongst Republicans and conservatives. Can you share any of those?
So this is interesting because, as I was about to say listeners, but viewers, I guess, probably know, we've seen some big names on the, I guess what you'd call the conservative web, or the media ecosystem that kind of surrounds Republican politics and MAGA and Trump generally. The biggest example of this is obviously Tucker Carlson, who was a supporter of the Iraq War, and it kind of towed the line when it came to a lot of these issues for most of his career, but has generated lots of attention for criticizing the Trump administration on this issue. He obviously has a massive following. He's not the only one. We saw people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massey, who have are in Congress, have prominent platforms. The interesting thing about this is when we look at the polling, independents, and this isn't really talked about all that much, but in addition to Democrats, independents have really flipped on this issue, people who identify themselves as independents. Not as dramatically as Democratic voters, but that shift is still there as well. A majority of them now pretty much oppose what Israel does in Palestine and tend to sympathize more with Palestinians than Israelis. when you look at the numbers for Republicans, they're still kind of the only political group in the United States that still has an overwhelming level of support for Israel. It's something like 64% of even like the most generous polls say that well over 50% of Republicans support what Israel's doing and support the U.S. support what the U.S. is doing in terms of backing Israel and providing them with military aid. Where the numbers become much more interesting, in my opinion, this is something that I've covered a lot over the last maybe 6 months to a year, is that if you look at younger conservative voters, and we have to believe that many of these people are getting their information from, people like Tucker Carlson or people with, their own independent platforms outside of the mainstream media, like not necessarily the places that we usually associate with conservative politics for decades, like a Fox News, for instance. We see that young people have turned on Israel in much the same way that young people have turned on Israel across the political spectrum. And for that matter, across the religious spectrum. Even polling shows us that young Jewish people have turned on Israel because they don't have this existential connection to the country in the way that their parents or their grandparents did. So that same Pew poll that I just cited showed that, an overwhelming Republican support for Israel. But if you look at the breakdown generationally, 50% of GOP voters under the age of 50 expressed a negative view. So that's when it really becomes interesting. There was a University of Maryland poll, I think from last August, which found that just 24% of Republican voters between the ages of 18 to 34 sympathize more with Israelis than Palestinians. So yes, on the whole, we still see broad support for Israel and its policies and U.S. support for it among Republicans. But when we start looking at those numbers and actually breaking them down, we see that the generational shift is happening. And it's happening at a very similar pace, frankly, to the Democratic and independent shift. And it makes you wonder how much longer those numbers are going to hold up on the other end, like as more and more young people, obviously become older, and we see that spread out. It's, in my opinion, just a matter of time before you start seeing it slip among the vast majority of Republicans. I think in the next few years, the numbers point to that potentially happening.
Yeah. So we have this polling information that shows this sort of groundswell of voters, both liberal and conservative, Democrat, Republican, starting to side with Palestinians, starting to reject Israel. And the question becomes, how does this get translated into politics? And one of the interesting other themes that you've been covering, which is one indication of this, is looking at organizations like AIPAC, looking at organizations associated with the Israel lobby, and suddenly they are no longer welcome in some Democratic Party circles because Israel and the organizations associated with it have become so toxic. Can you talk some about how does this actually play out? Are there actually Democratic lawmakers who are distancing themselves from AIPAC?
Yeah, there absolutely is people distancing themselves from AIPAC. I'd say we should note that AIPAC has had a branding issue for going on a decade now. A few years ago, and this has been a huge part of our reporting in recent years, a few years ago, for years, AIPAC's line was, we don't actually intervene directly in elections. We just go to Washington and we try to sway policy. They changed that alleged policy. I mean, if you looked at the details, that actually wasn't true, but they became more blatant about what they were doing a few years ago when they created a super PAC. They called the super PAC United Democracy Project, no reference to AIPAC or Israel in the name of the super PAC. And they started running ads attacking politicians for, calling for aid to Israel to be conditioned, or, politicians that had highlighted Palestinian human rights. In those ads, they never mention Israel because they know it's not a popular topic among the American people. The branding it's just gotten worse and worse for them in terms of branding. So we're seeing that play out. So I think in this election, AIPAC is going to go into it absolutely as a pariah in a way that they never have been before. We have centrist Democrats. We have people like Seth Moulton out of Massachusetts, who's trying to take down Ed Markey, longtime senator in Massachusetts. Obviously, it's regarded as the bluest of the blue states. He, former AIPAC recipient, now says he refuses to take money from AIPAC. He's giving the money back. I think he's the fourth member of the House to say that. So we know that it's good politics for Democrats at this point to come out and say that they don't support AIPAC. And I think we're seeing that play out. And I think it'll be interesting. There's a race that we covered the other day in The Shift, the newsletter, New Jersey's 11th district, where Tom Malinowski's running for Congress there. And he's, again, a former AIPAC ally, a longtime supporter of Israel. And his big crime is that he recently has been saying maybe we should condition military aid to Israel based on what Netanyahu's doing. And for that, AIPAC is now targeting him directly. This is a former ally and a pro-Israel former Congress member who they're targeting. And they're not targeting him with ads saying you should vote against this guy because he doesn't stand up for Israel. They're targeting him with ads accusing him of supporting Trump's agenda when it comes to ICE because he backed a DHS bill from a few years ago. So it's another example where we're seeing them have to shift to the moment and kind of recalibrate the way that they do politics and the way that they intervene in elections so that their fingerprints aren't easily noticeable, I think, by the American public, because they know there's going to be that backlash based on everything we were just talking about before, the declining brand of Israel among the American people.
Yeah. Well, so that's a great point. And just want to point out for our watchers and listeners, Michael referenced it, but every week Michael publishes a newsletter called The Shift that follows all of these issues. So if you're interested in what we're talking about, please subscribe to that newsletter. There should be information on how to do so in the show notes to this discussion. Okay, the numbers are overwhelming, and the numbers are so overwhelming that even AIPAC is becoming a pariah and won't even mention Israel in its own election work. It seems like we're just then on the verge of the U.S. government ditching Israel altogether, right? Like what left is there to be done? And yet, day to day, policy seems like it's not moving at all. Policy seems like it's not changing at all. How do you understand, or what explains that difference? Nobody supports this anymore. Even the organizations pushing it can't say so outwardly, and yet nothing's changing, or it seems.
This is kind of the $6 million question. I mean, people will remember in 2020 when Bernie Sanders was running for president, there was a lot of polling done among the American people regarding his domestic agenda or what he was proposing. And it showed that, a vast majority of Democratic voters, for instance, support things like the Green New Deal and Medicare for all. And yet we've seen no political push at the congressional level, aside from a couple exceptions, but we've seen nothing in terms of, like a big robust movement the way that we saw during, say, the New Deal. So there's that disconnect. And in my opinion, Israel has just become another one of those things. It's just another thing where the American people are completely disconnected from their politicians on an issue, right? And the question about why that is, the question about how you would get from point A to point B, I think is an important one. That's something that we cover at the site every week. And I think there's a lot of reasons, but I mean, to be a little concise here, I think in many ways it encompasses some of the things we've already discussed, right? Like the Israel lobby, for instance. I mean, you have a big lobby that shows up in districts and scares people and makes them think, if I say X, Y, and Z about Israel, these people could show up in my district and spend $4 million to take me down. And people don't really want to deal with that. I don't think they want to deal with Palestinian protesters either, or backlash on that level, but they're trying to thread a needle here. So the interesting thing I think will be the next couple of years coming out of what happened in New York City in the fall. They used pro-Israel groups like AIPAC used all these and all kinds of pro-Israel organizations and pundits used all these kind of tropes, tried to use all these kind of tropes against Mamdani and attack him for being anti-Israel, accused him of anti-Semitism, all the usual stuff. And Cuomo really leaned into that and thought it would improve his standing among the New York voters. And I think it completely backfired in many ways. If you look at the polling, there's every reason to believe that this issue actually hurt Cuomo and helped Mamdani. Because for the first time, a lot of people who support Palestinian rights were going to the polls to vote for somebody who they felt like agreed with them on issues like BDS. So I think that, and we'll look back on that moment, I think, as a kind of flashpoint moment. And I think coming out of it, that is, I think, shaken up to some extent the way that Democrats are going to look at the way that they're going to approach their elections. And I think it's going to be very interesting over the next year to see how this all plays out. But I think it's definitely a push and pull. There's lots of factors. But yeah, I think Israel has just become another thing where we see that the ruling class, the lawmakers in the United States are completely disconnected from their constituency on this issue.
Yeah. And in the few minutes that we have left for this discussion, we do have midterm elections coming up this year. Are we starting to see how these dynamics are playing out? Are there more Mondanis coming down the line, or more people who are candidates who are trying to toe more to the center on this question?
I think we're going to see a lot of the Seth Moulton approach, right? Because it's like when we already have some like presidential hopeful, you know how as soon as an election ends, the next one's already starting. The way that like our media cycle works, and we've seen these people who aspire to be the next Democratic nominee, whether it's Josh Shapiro, whether it's Gavin Newsom. We've seen them make the rounds on popular podcasts and cable news shows. And what's been interesting to me is how a lot of these politicians have been challenged on their support for AIPAC or on their support for the genocide directly by kind of mainstream, for lack of a better term, pundits or podcasts. Whereas I don't think they would have been, even a couple years ago. I do think that it's not dramatic to say the genocide has changed a lot of things, not just around the world and obviously in Gaza, but also in the United States. I think it's like the ship is out of the bottle, or whatever the term is. I don't think Israel can get it back in, is what I'm saying. I don't think that there's a way for them to win back the American public, especially if you look at the polling. There was a certain level of sympathy among the American people after October 7th. You usually see this after those kind of events. There was a little rise in terms of support, and they've over the last 2.5 years, if you look at the polling, it's just completely been squandered and then some. So I think that absolutely we're going to see it play out. I think there's going to be more and more questions, even among the mainstream media, about these kind of groups, and I think that politicians are going to be put on the spot, and it will be very interesting to see how they navigate. But I think we're going to see more Seth Moulton type of stuff. I think we're going to see more. The person makes a distinction between Israel and Netanyahu's Israel. They make maybe a big deal about AIPAC, but none of the other lobbying groups, because of course AIPAC is not the only lobbying group. There's all kinds of ways for pro-Israel groups to filter money into races without using AIPAC. So I think that there's going to be a lot of Democrats trying to finesse there and thread the needle and kind of work it both ways, where it's like they're not getting criticized necessarily by pro-Palestine individuals, and they're also not being criticized by the lobby. And I think it's going to be tough.
Yeah, well, it's a story and a dynamic and results that we are going to continue to follow for sure. And I'm sure this is a topic that we'll return to. But for now, let's move on to the discussion that we are all watching play out online and trying to understand the dynamics of, and that is the ongoing Jeffrey Epstein scandal, and especially from our point of concern, where U.S. foreign policy fits into this. Just earlier this week, when this latest release of emails came out, you did a story for the site unpacking all the ways that Israel is mentioned. So we will include a link to that. Please go read that article. We don't necessarily want to recount that all now. But what I am interested in talking about with you right now is there's been millions of documents, all these different ways, all these different people that are getting mentioned. And I'm very interested to hear from you, and I have some thoughts as well. Just what is the takeaway here? What have we learned? What is there to understand from what we've seen from these Epstein files? And of course, for our corner of interest, although this is not the only question for us to look at, what is the Israel connection? Was Epstein working for Mossad? Was Epstein working for the CIA or other intelligence services? I will say we're not breaking any news on this podcast. We don't know the answers to those questions, but we do have some opinions about it. And I know that you've been looking at these as close as anyone. So I guess I'm wondering if we could just start off, what is your takeaway from what you've seen so far?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff is obviously an open question. I think to an extent, it's almost, the reality is there's a lot of stuff we can confirm. So on some level, is Jeffrey Epstein the Mossad? Is he secretly working for Israel? It's almost what we see from the documents is whether the connection on that level is direct or not. We see all these things are still happening. He still had vast connections, obviously, to people in the Israeli government, people connected to Israeli leaders. I think the Epstein saga, there's so many elements to it. I mean, like our beat, there's the celebrity element. There's so many ways to kind of analyze all these documents that we've seen, and it says so much. But at some level, I think it does say something about the way our country operates, the way capitalism operates, the way that the world, economic system and powerful people move around. And there was a great piece, I thought, a very popular piece on our site in December that I would encourage everybody to check out as well, which is written by Phil Wise, Mondoweiss founder, who covered this New York Times story. They wrote a huge investigative piece about the rise of Jeffrey Epstein, basically how he got rich. And Phil's take was kind of that, very, very good, very interesting information in that piece, but it really left out the Israel component, that it really left out how Israel factored into Jeffrey Epstein's life and how people connected to Israel helped him get where he ended up being. So when we see this recent trove of documents, it's a lot of the same. The story that you referenced that I did was kind of just picking out the Israel stuff. I mean, we have former Israeli Prime Minister Barak reaching out to Epstein, trying to set up an interview between Donald Trump and an Israeli news station. We had, Epstein associates who worked on apparently getting Indian Prime Minister to Israel for a diplomatic trip in 2017. I think it's the Indian government leadership there had requested meeting members of Trump's inner circle, like, Jared Kushner, Steve Bannon. And then maybe the most interesting document to me was this document that people may have seen, which was kind of somebody had emailed Epstein basically effectively revealing what seemed like a plot to seize Libya's frozen assets. This is months after Gaddafi had been ousted in a coup, NATO-backed coup. The email sent to Epstein estimated that something like $33 billion in Libyan funds were frozen. And this person who emailed him was kind of basically inquiring about is there a way to kind of get that money? So I think they're very interesting documents, obviously, and you kind of see these themes throughout them. But it really shows how it's really revealing. There's a lot of stuff in there that's really revealing about how our government works, the governments work around the world, and really how our economic and political systems function, how they protect powerful people, and how they're basically able to carry out these vast crimes and basically face no consequences.
Yeah, I'll say it feels like, and it's one of the things that's been striking to me is, of course, this story started for many of us in terms of this just horrific details around sex trafficking and the death and just the way that Epstein and his network treated these young women. And that is still obviously a part of the story that needs to be held central. But it also feels like that movie that we've seen where like the police think they've tracked down like a killer, and then they enter the house and realize that they're actually a serial killer. Or right. They're trying to track down a serial killer and then find out that it's actually this broad international conspiracy. Like that, what we learned at the beginning of this story really was just the tip of the iceberg for this massive conspiracy, international conspiracy of just illegality and even things that were not illegal, but sort of pulled down the shade on just how the world works, and especially how the Western elite works. And so I know when this story started happening, and it's something that Phil Weiss and I have talked a lot about over the years. And of course, it was this question, well, what was Epstein's connection to Israel? What was Epstein's connection to Mossad? And I feel like which is their, Secret Service and just sort of like CIA agency. And I feel like the more information that has gotten released, and so at one point it looked like, well, obviously he was, but the more information that gets released, I feel like that picture gets muddied, but it almost becomes a distinction without a difference. So whether he was working for Mossad, whether he was working for the CIA, or whether he was just working independently in league with the incredibly rich and powerful members of the Western elite, and it was almost entirely Western, but also European, not just American. At the end, it's the same thing. And Israel is a project of that Western elite. So of course he was working for Israel and for Israelis' interests, because he was working in the interest of the people that are looking and want Israel to succeed in what it's doing in Palestine. So I just think the more information we've gotten, the more complicated that picture has gotten, but also a bit more simplified too. And where we all enter this story through these horrific stories of sex trafficking also gets reconfirmed with every new thing, because the same way that like the members of his network think about those young women who were being tortured in that way,
Right.
it's clear that's the same way that they think about us and everybody who is not in their network. And so we see these leaders who are carrying out genocide in Palestine. We see them also not caring and making jokes at the expense of regular people all across the world. So it has there are still many details left to be clarified, but the I think in a lot of ways this message has been very clear.
Yeah, and I think it also, the only thing I'd add there is just I agree with everything you said, but I also think, another big story is, Jeffrey Epstein, obviously a horrible person, a convicted sex criminal, and yet, not elected by anyone, obviously not a lawmaker, not working in the shadows, so to speak. Most people don't know the details of his life until these stories started breaking. And yet, when someone wants to set up a diplomatic mission to Israel, or somebody wants Trump to go on Israeli TV, or somebody wants to, can I get this money from Libya? They're not reaching out to, politicians. They're reaching out to Jeffrey Epstein. So it's like, I think in the last 5, 6 years, especially with, everything that's happened with Elon Musk and, Peter Thiel, Zuckerberg, it's just this whole, apparatus of people with lots and lots of money who obviously exert political influence, answer to no one.
Yeah.
And this is just probably the tip of the iceberg when it comes to that kind of, not just, as you mentioned, depravity, but also just really one of these old school, like how the world actually works type of moments, where it's like, it confirms a lot of the worst impulses or conspiracies that people have had for years in terms of how people with lots of money and power are connected to educational institutions, to economic institutions, to political leaders. And like I said, it's the tip of the iceberg. Who knows what we're not seeing, and who knows what's done that we'll never know about.
And ultimately, and in the same way, and I don't know if this is totally true, but I'm going to say it anyway. But in the same way that the initial impetus of this story, I feel like, is receding from the headlines in some ways as revelation after revelation comes out, there seems to be also, to me, in this way, that Jeffrey Epstein himself is becoming less the focus. And in a way, and again, we still have yet to learn things, but the more that I see of this, the more it feels to me that Epstein himself was pretty maybe secondary, that he is really a node in this kind of connecting point of this network. But the story is the network. And the story is like what you're saying, the way that the world works, the way that these elites interact with each other, including government officials, that go completely around whatever other bodies or or these are supposed to be happening in a more transparent way. And of course, a large part of that includes just naked illegality and disgustingness. But I do think as this advances, I do wonder if not only the initial crimes, but even Epstein himself will become understood as a more marginal figure to really this network and the way the world works.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think you're probably right. I think, like I said, I think in many ways this is just the tip of the iceberg. And I think maybe we'll look back on Epstein as kind of a moment where some floodgates were opened. And it'll be interesting to see what the other side of this looks like, and if we actually see anything come of it in terms of reform or change, or resistance from people throughout the world to this kind of system.
For sure, for sure. All right. Well, I want to move on to just our last segment, which will be relatively short, but we've talked big politics. We've talked this sort of horrible scandal that continues to unfold with Epstein. There are a lot of other stories going on, and I just want to spend our last few minutes. Just what are other stories on your radar? What are things that we maybe will return to in future episodes, or that we should be looking for in terms of coverage on the site, or just what are you thinking about? And I know I have some stories.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing, I think a newsletter will go out today. I was going to mention just quickly, people probably saw this story. I know we've talked about it a little off the air, but there was a report from Reuters, very interesting report, that in the early days of the genocide, there was this memo that was, or a series of memos that were circulated about the situation in Gaza, which were just kind of describing these ghastly situations, obviously, which began almost immediately. And details of dead bodies being found in abandoned cars, and human bones on the ground, and I think one of the this came from the U.S. Agency for International Development. Some staffers had drafted these memos. They referred to northern Gaza at that point, as an apocalyptic wasteland. That's a direct quote. And what we learned from this really great Reuters reporting is that this February 2024 cable was basically blocked or suppressed by Jack Lew, who at the time was the ambassador to Israel, ambassador to Jerusalem, and his deputy, Stephanie Hallett. They basically, so these are Biden administration officials. The idea was these cables were sent. Hypothetically, they would have gone through multiple people throughout the United States government who would have learned about them. But basically, Jack Lew and Stephanie Hallett blocked them from getting that level of exposure, and stomped them out, or I don't think it's hyperbole to say repress them. And obviously, during the Biden administration, we saw an unprecedented amount, I thought, of people kind of quit their positions, or come out and denounce what they were doing, or leave the government over the genocide. Something we really didn't see, in my opinion, at all. I can't readily think of anybody under, say, like the drone program under Obama or something. I thought some of that was a little unprecedented. And I have to believe there would have been more of those if more people were kind of like aware of this report. It was completely repressed by Jack Lew. And it's just another kind of like, there's so much happening in the news that I'm sure maybe some people missed it, but it's just another example of how we see the Trump administration now, but really a bipartisan project here. The Biden administration and now the Trump administration, complicit when it comes to all of Israel's atrocities in Gaza, not just backing them, but blocking information. The reason cited by Jack Lew and Stephanie Hallett for blocking that report was that it wasn't balanced, quote unquote. I mean, this is a report about, dead bodies and human bones and people not being able to get food. I don't know where the balance could possibly be when it comes to that, but it's unfortunately not surprising. But I think it's just a reminder of how terrible, the genocide has been, and how reprehensible U.S. policy has been in regard to the genocide.
Completely agreed. I think the story of the Biden administration's role in the genocide is a story that we will never stop following, will never stop enraging me. It'll be a story that continues to unfold for years. So no, definitely thank you for raising that. And I guess another story that's just sort of on my radar, just to point to, is, yesterday, we're meeting on February 5th. Yesterday, the Washington Post, Jeffrey Bezos, led the firing of, I forget the actual percentage, but a large number, I think 300 members of the Washington Post staff, which included all of their international reporters. This is also at this moment where we've watched the notorious Bari Weiss taking over CBS News and injecting her sort of pro-Israel bias into their coverage. And so we're seeing this moment where billionaires, in addition to the facts that are coming out around the Epstein story, billionaires, whether they're in league with Trump or not, flexing their muscle, especially in this media sphere. And news like what you were just talking about in terms of what's happening in Gaza, and just what's happening in Palestine in general, is becoming that much harder to find because of it. So I just end on that note to somewhat talk about the importance of the work that you do, the importance of the work that we do at Mondoweiss. There's going to be a number of different links to different articles that we've talked about in the show notes to this discussion, in addition to subscribing to the Shift newsletter and subscribing to just the general Mondoweiss newsletter to really keep up with all of our reporting and all the latest news from and about Palestine. So I think that wraps our first meeting. Is that the word? Meeting of the Shift, but our first shift.
Our first shift.
But thank you, Michael. I look forward to doing this with you.
Thank you, Adam. This was fun.
All right. See you in about a month.
Okay, great.
All right.